Well, today is the last Sunday of the church year. It's New Year's Eve, I guess. It's the last day, the last Sunday of the liturgical year, and for many years, particularly perhaps in the Roman Catholic tradition, horror of horrors, it's been known as Christ the King Sunday. Sometimes now it's known as the Reign of Christ, and for those who can also select this Sunday, if those are too uncomfortable, to be Aotearoa Sunday. So I decided I'd take the easy course of action at St Matthew's and talk about Christ the King Sunday. It kind of makes sense if you think about it. The whole year we've been telling the Christian faith story. We've been telling stories about the unique influence of that man, Jesus of Nazareth, who lived on earth, we say, in historical time, and in whom divine presence was discerned, in some way made startlingly real. It makes sense to end the year saying that something really changed. Things were reordered as a result of that particular life. That's if you are a Christian. That somehow it reveals there is a viable alternative world, a way in how we can be together and order our life together in this same world. Well, 2,000 odd years later, as we look around our world, it doesn't seem to be a very likely claim, does it? It doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence that everything's changed, but the story that makes this claim, the niggling, irritating, won't ever quite go away faith story, refuses to give up that claim that the world is indeed threaded through with divine presence. And ultimately, it is beyond our human capacity to unstitch that. Now, whether we refer to it as Christ the King or the reign of Christ, each imply there is a geography of living, a kingdom or a sovereignty. There is a location, and what is more, there is an acknowledged leadership. It is not no one over nowhere, but someone over somewhere. It is a very concrete thing that is being said. I suspect that the idea of kingship or reign over, even if it is Christ, sits a little uneasily with us. It raises spectres, if it's a king, of patriarchy, of status and privilege that is gained by right of birth, not worth, stories of misuse of power, of corruption without censure. But how many of us here have actually lived in a monarchy with a regent who actively rules, complete with the whole social system of support? How many of us actually done that to know what it's like? I suspect most of us are accustomed to living in some version of democracy with a flattened class system where each adult at least has a right of say in determining who leads and what the laws of the nation are. So the social system of monarchy may be outside our lived experience, but I would suggest that we are very familiar with the top-down power system that comes with it. In our world, we know that countries and rulers and people who have many resources do indeed exercise power over those made less by their fewer or no resources. Those with less are subject to, are kept distance from, are done to. It's circumstance of birth or geography or race or religion or gender. It's those things that make them powerless. This is not new. It is a common and a kingly story of human life on earth, of systems of power and misuse of power, of injustice, of abuse, and careless disregard of the sanctity of life. Jesus' crucifixion in today's gospel is outcome of the power of such systems. So I would say these top-down systems are familiar to us, and as uncomfortable as it may be to say, often if not, it is the way we operate too, for it is in us. We are born into a society that is dominated by that way of doing it, and we are formed by it. We are wired to survive, so we strive to succeed, to have power to gain for ourselves, even if, for as long as we can remember, we have spoken against those systems, we have resisted them, we have worked to unmask them, to make change. It is hard to not do our resistance by exactly the same way of operating, misusing our power to impose our alternative vision of the way things should be on those who are different from us. Now, it might be easier to simply not keep Christ the King Sunday, to avoid or dismiss its imagery, its location in our tradition. But before we discard it out of our discomfort, I think there's merit in considering why it has place. Is something being said through this, maybe being asked of us? To what system of living do we ally ourselves? What does it ask of us, and how are we actually living it out? I suggest it further proposes that it is possible for us, native to us, to live in a way personified in the person of Jesus, as told in the stories passed down to time. What might that look like? As people who seek to live in honest transparency to divine presence, who value the gift that is life and seek for its flourishing, who name injustice, who refuse to participate in unjust systems and work for restoration, who are willing to remain in the presence of suffering brokenness, because in us is a hope, a deep knowing that this is not the entire story. Which all sounds rather ideal, does it not? If we go with that understanding of what it means and the words of teaching attributed to Jesus that invert the established order, maybe all we need to do is to say, well, we're going to apply that to Christ as King. We're going to make that Christ the one that reigns, and everything will be sorted. You think about that. The last shall be first, and the first shall be last. We are to serve, not to be served. That is an inversion, but it still operates within a ranked system. If we replace Christ as King, the ruler as the one in charge, and claim that Christ does things upside down, so it's actually different, but we don't question the system itself, the fundamental underpinnings by which it operates, then I suggest nothing really has changed. And it takes very little time for Christ to become the power figure in a hierarchical system that you and I are powerless before. For us to take the place given us, accept the inevitability of what happened, and give up our responsibility to make any change. How might we disentangle ourselves? Well, one of the things about catching the bus to work is it gives you time to think, which is good and bad depending on the day. I got to thinking about stories this week, about stories with longevity, the ones that last, like our faith narrative stories, and funnily enough, like fairy stories, which also include kings and queens and all number of other mythical beasties. They last, I believe, because they are stories of life. By this I mean they are living stories. Such stories allow us to encounter real life. They are populated by characters we recognise, who exert influences in ways we know, even if the events or characters in the story are mythically exaggerated. They inhabit the landscapes and they engage in the activities of real life. Giving voice to our deeper truths, they name our fears, our hopes, our aspirations and dreams. They let our best and maybe our worst selves be revealed, unshackled from the chains of our ordinary day, compromises and limitations. They allow us to stand face to face with what is, with what could be, to consider the consequences of our choices without having to try them out first. Stories that have stood the test of time are adaptable. They relate to and resonate with real life. Their struggle is ours. They mirror the moving fluidity and flexibility of life as we grow and change. If they cease to resonate as truthful, they cease to relate to or to speak into or reflect our experience of life, then I don't think we'd keep telling them. And might this be something of our uneasiness at having Christ the King included in our faith and liturgical narrative? Has it become a story without life, for it's out of relationship with our life? But before we judge this image, I think there's a couple or three questions we might ask of ourselves. We might first ask ourselves what we imagine our faith looks like in real life. We have a faith in our head and in our heart. What does it look like in real life? What difference do we imagine our faith makes to the life of the world? What is the point of faith-bearing that we trust ourselves to? What does it look like? What difference does it make? And what is the point? Because I think this influences how we create our image of Christ as King. It is, after all, we, humans, who have given this name to the experience of the divine. It is, after all, a human claim of hope arising out of our divine indwelling, calling us to recognise and to be presence of divine life in the world. Does the faith that is in us call us to create edifices for God, concrete statements of God, certainties that mimic the grandness, the grandeur of royal splendour, in service of a kingly God, kept very safe within religious walls? Or does the faith that is in us call us to risk treading trails of transformation that refuse to be converted by and to become fixed certainties of power? Call us to trust that the integrity of our vulnerable imperfection is sufficient to reveal the living, changing, ever-revealing presence of divine life? Are we willing to participate in transformation at the same time that we're being transformed? We're at the end of the year where we've been telling the story of the Incarnation. So I thought 4th century Athanasius might give us a bit of a story about Incarnation King style. It's been adapted and expanded by Bruce McLaren. You may have heard it before, but I thought it timely. And it begins as all good stories do. Once upon a time, there was a good and kind king who had a great kingdom with many cities. In one distant city, some people took advantage of the freedom the king gave them and started doing evil. They profited by their evil, and they began to fear the king would interfere and throw them in jail. Eventually, these rebels seethed with hatred for the king. They convinced the city that everyone would be better off without the king, and the city declared its independence from the kingdom. But soon, with everyone doing whatever they wanted, disorder reigned in the city. There was violence, hatred, lying, oppression, murder, slavery, fear. The king thought, what should I do? If I take my army and conquer the city by force, the people will fight against me, and I'll have to kill so many of them, and the rest will only submit through fear or intimidation, which will make them hate me and all I stand for even more. How does that help them? To be either dead or imprisoned or secretly seething with rage. But if I leave them alone, they'll destroy each other. And it breaks my heart to think of the pain they're causing and experiencing. So the king did something very surprising. He took off his robes and he dressed in the rags of a homeless wanderer. In disguise, he entered the city and began living in a vacant lot near a garbage dump. He took up a trade, fixing broken pottery and furniture. Whenever people came to him, his kindness and goodness and fairness and respect were so striking that they would linger just to be in his presence. They would tell him their fears and questions and ask his advice. He told them that the rebels had fooled them and that the true king had a better way to live, which he exemplified and taught. One by one, then two by two, and then by hundreds, people began to have confidence in him and live in his way. Their influence spread to others, and the movement grew and grew until the whole city regretted its rebellion and wanted to return to the kingdom again. But ashamed of their horrible mistake, they were afraid to approach the king, believing he would certainly destroy them for their rebellion. But the king in disguise told them the good news. He was himself the king, and he loved them. He held nothing against them, and he welcomed them back into his kingdom, having accomplished by a gentle, subtle presence what never could have been accomplished through brute force.